Lesson, we're going to go over question 5 of the Code Platoon application, changing sequence. So the question reads, have the function changing sequence take in an array of numbers stored in array and return the index at which the numbers stop increasing and begin decreasing, or stop decreasing and begin increasing. For example, if the array is 1, 2, 4, 6, 3, 1, then the program should return 3 because 6 is the last point in the array where the numbers were increasing, and the next number begins a decreasing sequence. The array will contain at least 3 numbers, and it may contain only a single sequence, increasing or decreasing. If there is only a single sequence in the array, then the program should return -1. Indexing should begin with 0. So looking at this question, we have 2 examples down here that show if this is the array that is input, then we should receive 3. So if we're looking at this one, the point where it changes from increasing to decreasing or vice versa should be 3. So looking at this, index 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3, is going to be 6, and that looks right. This increases and then begins to decrease. The same for this one. Looking at this, index 5 should be where we see a change in the direction. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So everything is increasing up until we get to index 5. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And after 5, at 6, it starts to decrease. So that looks correct. So the first thing we're going to do is you want to write out your pseudocode. Essentially, come up with a plan. How are you going to attack it? So the first step that we're going to do, identify the max and the min. So that's very important for identifying how we're going to see when these change. Essentially, you may need to look at the problem and visualize it. What worked for me is to actually create a table to see how it would actually look, and that's how I came up with the idea of maxing or doing a max or a min. So if you look down here, we have some sample arrays. So I laid these arrays out in a way where if we were to put these up against a y-axis, this is how they would look. So -1, 1, 2, 3, 5. So -1 is at its lowest and it continues to go up. If we were to plot this out, we've got a straight line. So that is only going from the lowest point to the max. So that is only increasing. The same would be if it were going in the opposite direction, if we were to reverse this array. Another circumstance would be if, we have an example right here, going from 4, 3, 1, 2, and 5. So when we map it out against our imaginary y-axis, we go 4, 3, 1, and then you see it starts to go back up, 2, 5. So it essentially creates that minimum. So that 1 should be our minimum. The same for here. We have -2, 1, 4, 6, and 5. So -2, 1, 4, 6. And then once we start to decrease, it goes down again against that y-axis. So that 6 is the max. That is the last point that it goes up. So the answer for these should be 0, 1, 2, 3. So 3 should be our answer because that is where the 6 occurs. And then the same for here, 0, 1, 2. So 2 should be the answer because that is where the minimum occurs. That's where the 1 is. For this one, because it's only increasing, we should only receive a -1. So let's get going and figure out how we're going to put this into our code. So starting off, we have our function, we take in the array, and step 1, we are going to identify our max. So we're going to create a variable equals max, and we're going to use a math function. So we're going to do math.max. If you're not aware, in order to apply a math function to an array, you actually need to do math.max.apply, and then we're going to put null and array. That should give us our max. So if we take this, actually we need to work this out. That's why. Sorry. Okay, so now that we have created that variable, my apologies, let's test it. We're going to return max. All right, so that gives us our max of all of these. So that is good to go. And then we're going to do the same thing down here for the minimum. And as you can see, reading is fundamental, especially when it comes to coding. And then we have all of our mins right here. So now we know what our maximums and our minimums are, and we've already visualized. So now we want to get an idea of which sort of circumstances we need to include. So the next step in our pseudocode was to create if statements for the different array situations. So the different situations that I was able to come up with was, naturally, if it's increasing or decreasing and there is no change as the text told us, as the question told us, then the answer should be -1. So those are down here. So let's start with some different circumstances. So right here, if there's a max, it should be greater than the first and last indices. So because a max, as we see down here, means that it's going up and down. So this amount, whatever, if you do the index of that particular spot, the value should be greater than the last value and the first value. So additionally, and again, that's going to return the index of the max. Also, if there is a minimum, it should be greater than the first and the last indices. Sorry, that is a typo. It should be less than the first and last indices. So as we saw with when you have a minimum, you're scooping down, and that minimum should be less than the index of 0 and the last index. And then finally, the other situations that we discussed, if there's no change in the sequence, i.e. if there's decreasing or increasing, then we want to return -1. And we'll probably have to do one we could do one together, or I'll probably just do 2 separate ones because it's just cleaner for me. But you do whichever one makes your heart feel good. All right, so down here, we're going to start writing our code. So we're just going to do a simple if, else if statements to encapsulate all of those scenarios. So if the minimum is less than the array of 0, so if the minimum is less than the index of the first index and the minimum is less than the last index, so we're going to do, we have the array right here, so this is the total array, but over here we need to put the index that we want to use. So that's going to be array.length -1. So if the minimum is less than the first and the last, then we're going to return the index of that minimum. So, and this essentially lets us know that that minimum is not the first or the last, and that there is actually a change in the direction of that array. After that, we're going to put if the max is greater than the first index, and if the max is greater than the very last index, then that means that we have this situation right here. In which case, we're going to return the index of the max. If the minimum is equal to the first index and the maximum is equal to the last index, then that means that it is an increasing array. So we're going to return -1 per the instructions. And lastly, if the max is equal to 0 and the minimum is equal, the index of 0, and the minimum is equal to the last index, then that means that it is decreasing, in which case there is also no change. So we're going to return -1. So with those, we should be able to run our code and get these answers. These are our answers when we run that code. So let's check. So for this one right here, console.log, we've got 1, 2, 4, 6, and then it goes back down to 4, which means that we have a max right here. So this should return the index of that max, 0, 1, 2, 3. There we go. The same for down here. We've got -10, -4, 2, 7, 11, 13, and then back down to 9, which means that 13 is our turning point. 13 is going to be our max. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 should be our answer, and there it is. -1, 1, 2, 3, 5. So for this one, we actually do not have any sort of a change. It is all increasing. So we should expect to see -1, which we see right here. For example 4, it goes 4, 3, 1, 2. So it goes decreasing and then it increases after 1, which means that the index of 1, which would be 2, 0, 1, 2, should be our answer. And that's what we see right there. For example 5, we have -2, 1, 4, 6, and 5. So once we switch to decreasing, that means that 6 is our max. So 0, 1, 2, 3. 3 is the index of 6, and that's what we should expect to see up here. And our last check, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Very simple. It is all decreasing, so we should expect to not see an index. We should see -1, and that's what we see. And that is how we go through with this. Also, when you're going through, just a tip, what I like to do is I set up these matches. So as I'm going through, I can actually, I just bring them all through and do a return and just validate that it's what I would expect. So each of these should return a Boolean outcome. So it's either going to be true or false. So if one of these does not apply to one of these examples down here, then we should expect to see that up here. So it looks like all of these, except for this one, this is if the minimum is less than 0 and the minimum is less than the last one, then we should expect to see true. So the fourth one down here, that is the example where 4, 3, 1, 2, and then it goes back up to 5. So for this one, there is a minimum. So that is the one where we would expect to see that minimum as the pivot point. So again, for this one, if the maximum is greater than 0 and the maximum is greater than the last index, that means that we're dealing with something with an arch. A little more like this, where we have a maximum, and that's our turning point. So we should expect to see that one for anything that increases and then decreases. So it looks like we have true for the first two, and then for the second to last one. So let's look. Increase, 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 decrease, makes sense. Increase, 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 decrease, makes sense. For these, do we see? No, we don't. And then right here, it increases and then decreases. So that is good to go, and so on. This is just something that I like to do. It also helps when you're trying to troubleshoot your coding, just to make sure that things are coming out the way that they should. And additionally, I like to put a little bit of a cheater tool in here sometimes to make sure that I'm working with the correct numbers. So for this, it shows us what all of our minimums and our maximums are for each one of these. So little things like that just sort of make it a little bit easier when you're trying to figure it out. But that is the end of this lesson. That explains how we identified where the change is in this data set. And let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks.